The world just moved dangerously close to the brink of catastrophic conflict. Vladimir Putin has issued a direct and explicit threat to strike Britain, escalating tensions to levels not seen since the darkest days of the Cold War. This isn't vague sabre-rattling or diplomatic posturing. This is the Russian president publicly declaring that Britain has become a legitimate military target and that Russia is prepared to use force, potentially including strategic weapons against British territory. The threat comes in response to Britain's continued military support for Ukraine and to King Charles's recent statements condemning Russian aggression and calling for stronger NATO action to counter Putin's expansionist ambitions. The timing couldn't be more significant or more dangerous, occurring at a moment when NATO is already dealing with internal divisions, when Britain is navigating its own political turmoil following the Starmer crisis, and when Putin appears to have calculated that the West is vulnerable and divided enough that he can escalate threats without facing unified response. King Charles and senior NATO officials are in emergency meetings right now, trying to formulate a response that demonstrates resolve and unity while avoiding actions that could trigger the very conflict everyone is desperate to prevent. The crisis isn't just about one threat or one statement. It's about whether the post-Cold War international order that has maintained relative peace in Europe for decades can survive when confronted by a nuclear-armed power willing to threaten direct attacks on major Western nations. Britain is now in the extraordinary position of facing credible military threats from Russia while simultaneously dealing with domestic constitutional challenges and political instability that have weakened normal government authority. The Ministry of Defence has raised threat levels and activated contingency plans for various scenarios ranging from cyber attacks to actual military strikes. Intelligence services are working around the clock to assess whether Putin's threat represents genuine military planning or is primarily intended as intimidation to fracture Western unity on Ukraine. NATO member states are being briefed on the situation and are being asked to reaffirm alliance commitments and to prepare for potential collective response if Russia follows through on its threats. The crisis is unfolding in real time, with developments coming so rapidly that yesterday's assessments are already outdated and tomorrow's situation could be fundamentally different from today's. The specific threat from Putin came during a nationally televised address in Russia, where he outlined what he called Russia's red lines regarding Western military support for Ukraine. Putin stated explicitly that countries providing long-range weapon systems to Ukraine that could strike Russian territory, which includes Britain's recent delivery of advanced missile systems, had crossed a threshold that Russia could not ignore. He declared that Russia viewed such actions as direct participation in war against Russia and that this participation made those countries legitimate targets for Russian military response. The language was deliberately chosen to be unambiguous, with Putin using phrases like "we will consider all available options" and "no target will be off limits" that Russian officials have historically used immediately before military action. Intelligence analysts noted that similar rhetoric preceded Russian attacks on Georgia in 2008 and the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Suggesting this wasn't empty bluster, but rather represented genuine Russian policy decisions. Putin specifically mentioned Britain multiple times during his address, noting the country's historical antagonism toward Russia, its leading role in organising Western military support for Ukraine, and what he characterised as provocative statements from British political and royal figures about Russia's actions. The threat against Britain was therefore not incidental, but was deliberately emphasised as the primary focus of Russia's warnings about consequences for continued support to Ukraine. The immediate British response was coordinated between King Charles, who has taken a more active constitutional role since the Starmer crisis, senior military officials, and the interim government that has been managing day-to-day governance. King Charles made a brief public statement affirming that Britain would not be intimidated by threats and would continue to support Ukraine's right to defend itself against Russian aggression. The statement was carefully worded to be firm without being unnecessarily provocative. emphasising that Britain's actions were purely defensive in nature and were aimed at helping Ukraine protect its territory rather than attacking Russia. But the king also made clear that Britain took the Russian threat seriously and was prepared to defend itself and its allies through NATO collective security arrangements. Behind the scenes, the response was far more urgent and complicated. Emergency meetings of the Cobra Crisis Committee brought together military, intelligence and government officials to assess the threat level and to prepare response options. The Ministry of Defence activated several contingency plans that had been developed during the Cold War but updated for modern threats, including cyber attacks, strikes on critical infrastructure and potential use of strategic weapons. Military readiness levels were raised discreetly to avoid public panic, while ensuring that British forces could respond rapidly if Russian action materialised. Intelligence services intensified monitoring of Russian military movements and communications, looking for indicators that threats might be followed by actual operations. The NATO dimension of the crisis became critical immediately. Britain invoked Article 4 of the NATO Treaty, which allows any member to request consultations when they believe their security is threatened, triggering formal alliance discussions about collective response. The challenge was that NATO members had varying levels of concern about Putin's threats and varying appetites for confrontation with Russia. Some Eastern European members, particularly those with direct experience of Russian aggression or with substantial Russian minorities within their borders, viewed the threats as deadly serious and urged strong collective response, including forward deployment of NATO forces and explicit warnings that any attack on Britain would trigger Article 5 collective defence obligations. But other NATO members, particularly some Western European countries with stronger economic ties to Russia and with publics more wary of military confrontation, urged caution and argued for diplomatic engagement to de-escalate tensions rather than military posturing that could make the situation worse. Germany and France, traditional leaders of more accommodationist approaches to Russia, called for emergency diplomatic contacts to clarify Russian intentions and to explore whether compromises on Ukraine support could reduce tensions. Britain and the United States, along with Poland and Baltic states, argued that showing any weakness or willingness to compromise in response to threats would only encourage Putin to make more threats and would undermine the entire principle of collective security that NATO represented. The internal NATO debates revealed deep divisions that Putin had likely calculated would prevent unified response to his threats. The domestic British political situation complicated the crisis response in ways that wouldn't have been problematic under normal circumstances, with Starmer disgraced and expelled, with interim leadership lacking full political authority, and with general elections scheduled but not yet held. Britain lacks the kind of clear, legitimate political leadership that would normally coordinate national response to major security threats. King Charles had stepped into some of this vacuum through his more active constitutional role, but there were limits to how far the monarchy could go in making political and military decisions without proper democratic authorisation. The interim Prime Minister had authority to manage routine government business and to respond to emergencies, but major policy decisions about how aggressively to respond to Russian threats or what commitments to make to NATO allies required political legitimacy that the interim government lacked. Opposition parties were briefed on the crisis and generally supported firm response to Russian threats, but there were debates about whether Parliament should be recalled from recess to debate and authorise specific response measures. The constitutional uncertainty about decision-making authority in a major national security crisis exposed weaknesses in Britain's unwritten constitution and in the informal arrangements that had been created to manage government during the transition period following Starmer's removal. Russia appeared to be deliberately exploiting this weakness, calculating that Britain would have difficulty mounting coherent response when its political system was in flux. The military and strategic dimensions of the Russian threat were being carefully analysed to determine what Putin might actually be planning versus what he was threatening for political effect. Intelligence assessments noted several concerning indicators that suggested the threats might be backed by genuine military preparation. Russian strategic bomber aircraft had increased their activity near NATO airspace, conducting exercises that simulated attacks on Western targets. Submarine activity in the North Atlantic had increased significantly, with Russian vessels conducting operations that appeared designed to test NATO's ability to track and respond to underwater threats. Cyber attacks against British government, military and critical infrastructure systems had intensified, though attribution was complicated by Russia's use of proxy groups and criminal organisations to maintain plausible deniability. Most concerning were intelligence reports of unusual activity at Russian strategic weapons facilities, suggesting possible preparation for deployment or use of nuclear-capable systems, though analysts cautioned that such preparations could be intended as signalling rather than as actual preparation for strikes. The challenge for British and NATO planners was determining whether these activities represented genuine preparation for military action, whether they were primarily intended to intimidate and to force policy changes without actual conflict, or whether they were designed to probe Western responses and to identify weaknesses in defensive systems and alliance coordination. Each interpretation suggested different response strategies, and choosing wrong could either lead to escalation that brought on the very conflict everyone wanted to avoid, or could show weakness that encouraged Putin to make even more aggressive threats and actions. The public reaction in Britain to Putin's threats was a mixture of concern, anger and defiance that reflected the country's historical experience with existential threats and its cultural identity around not yielding to intimidation. Opinion polls showed that while most Britons were worried about the situation and wanted government to take the threats seriously, overwhelming majorities rejected any suggestion of reducing support for Ukraine or of compromising with Russia in response to threats. The British public had watched Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, had seen the war crimes and the deliberate targeting of civilians, and had concluded that appeasing Putin would only encourage more aggression rather than bringing peace. This public mood created political pressure on government and on King Charles to maintain firm stance despite the risks, as any appearance of backing down in response to threats would be seen as betrayal of both Ukraine and of Britain's own security interests and values. But beneath the defiant public mood was genuine concern about what Russian attack might actually mean. London, as a major global city and as the capital of a NATO member state that had been particularly vocal in supporting Ukraine, would presumably be a primary target if Russia followed through on threats. The city's population of nearly 9 million people, its concentration of government and economic infrastructure, and its symbolic importance all made it vulnerable in ways that created understandable anxiety. Civil defence authorities quietly updated guidance about what citizens should do in various emergency scenarios, trying to balance providing useful information with avoiding public panic. The economic dimensions of the crisis were also significant and complicated. Russia had already faced severe Western sanctions following its invasion of Ukraine, but those sanctions had not prevented Putin from continuing the war or from now escalating threats against NATO members. The question facing British and European policymakers was whether additional sanctions could change Russian behaviour, or whether they had already imposed maximum pain that Russia's leadership was willing to absorb. Britain had particular economic exposure to Russian retaliation because London's financial system remained deeply interconnected with global capital flows that included Russian money. Because British energy security, despite reduced direct dependence on Russian gas, still relied on global markets that Russia could disrupt, and because British businesses had investments and operations in Russia and in markets that Russia influenced. The threat of economic warfare alongside military threats created complex calculations about how to respond effectively without triggering economic damage that would be politically unsustainable. Some argued for imposing immediate additional sanctions as response to the threats, showing that intimidation would bring costs rather than concessions. Others argued for holding sanctions in reserve as leverage for de-escalation, maintaining that imposing them now would eliminate incentives for Russia to back down, while guaranteeing retaliation that would harm European economies. These debates reflected broader tensions between responding firmly to aggression and managing the practical costs and risks that such firmness entailed. The diplomatic efforts to manage the crisis involved multiple tracks and multiple players with varying degrees of coordination. The United States, as NATO's leading power and as the country with most military capacity to deter or respond to Russian action, was central to developing alliance strategy. President of the United States held direct conversations with King Charles and with other NATO leaders about coordinating response. American officials made clear that any Russian attack on Britain would be treated as attack on NATO that would trigger Article 5 collective defence obligations, and that the United States stood ready to use its full military capability to defend its allies. These reassurances were intended both to deter Russian action by making clear it would face overwhelming response and to reassure Britain and other allies that they weren't facing threats alone. But there were questions about whether Putin believed these commitments or whether he calculated that NATO unity would fracture when actually tested by Russian aggression. The European Union, which overlapped with but wasn't identical to NATO in its membership, pursued its own diplomatic outreach to Russia, trying to identify off-ramps from the crisis. Some EU members believe that Putin was looking for a face-saving way to back down from threats without appearing weak, and that providing such an off-ramp through diplomatic engagement was preferable to military confrontation that could spiral out of control. These EU diplomatic efforts created some tension, with the harder-line stance being advocated by Britain and Eastern European NATO members, who worried that premature diplomacy would be seen as weakness and would reward Putin's threatening behaviour. The role of King Charles in managing the crisis represented an unusual constitutional situation that reflected both the emergency circumstances and the new, more active approach to monarchy that Charles had been developing. Traditionally, British monarchs stayed completely out of security and foreign policy matters, except for ceremonial functions, with all substantive decisions made by elected government. But the interim nature of current British government, combined with the precedents Charles had already set by blocking Starmer's Judicial Accountability Bill and by overruling Sadiq Khan's London restrictions, created space for more direct royal involvement in crisis management. Charles was participating in security briefings, was being consulted on response options, and was using his constitutional position to coordinate between military, government and political leaders who might otherwise have difficulty achieving unified approach. His statements about the crisis carried weight both domestically and internationally, being seen as representing Britain's position in ways that statements from interim political leaders couldn't fully achieve. This active royal role was controversial among constitutional purists who worried about monarchy overstepping proper bounds, but it was broadly accepted given the emergency circumstances and the leadership vacuum that Starmer's disgrace and removal had created. The situation demonstrated both the flexibility of Britain's unwritten constitution in crisis and the potential problems when normal democratic governance was disrupted. The international community beyond NATO was also reacting to the crisis in ways that could influence its evolution. China, as Russia's most important international partner, though not a formal ally, was being pressed by Western powers to use its influence to moderate Russian behaviour. The argument was that China had no interest in nuclear confrontation that would devastate global economy and that would undermine the international system that China had benefited from enormously. Chinese officials responded with calls for all parties to show restraint and to resolve differences through dialogue, but avoided explicitly criticising Russian threats or supporting Western position. This neutrality was frustrating to NATO members who had hoped Chinese pressure might give Putin reason to reconsider, but it reflected China's strategic calculation that the crisis served its interests by distracting and dividing the West without creating risks that China would directly bear. India, another major power with significant relationship with Russia, took similar neutral stance that disappointed Western hopes for international pressure on Russian behaviour. The lack of broader international coalition against Russian threats meant that Putin could calculate that the costs of his threatening behaviour would be limited primarily to whatever NATO countries might impose, which he'd already demonstrated willingness to absorb. The resolution of the immediate crisis, to the extent it was resolved rather than simply evolving into a different phase of ongoing tension, came through a combination of Western firmness and Russian calculation that actual follow-through on threats would be too costly given unified NATO response. After several days of maximum tension, Russian actions began suggesting that the threats had been primarily intended to intimidate rather than as preparation for imminent military action. The unusual activities at strategic weapons facilities returned to normal patterns. The cyber attack intensity decrease, though, didn't cease entirely. Most significantly, Putin made statements that while maintaining tough rhetoric about Western actions being unacceptable, subtly walked back from the explicit threats to strike Britain. Russian officials began characterizing Putin's statements as warnings about hypothetical consequences if escalation continued, rather than as commitments to specific actions. This face-saving retreat allowed the immediate crisis to de-escalate without either side appearing to have completely backed down. Britain and NATO maintained their support for Ukraine and their firm stance that threatening behaviour wouldn't be rewarded with policy changes, while Russia claimed that its strong position had made the West think twice about escalation and had demonstrated that there were limits to how far support for Ukraine could go without consequences. The longer-term implications of the crisis were significant for European security, for NATO coherence, and for how international politics would function in a period of renewed great power competition. The crisis demonstrated that Russia under Putin was willing to make direct threats against major NATO members, which represented escalation beyond previous patterns where Russia had primarily threatened smaller neighbours, or had relied on economic and cyber warfare rather than explicit military threats against core Western powers. This reality required NATO to reconsider its assumptions and its readiness for potential conflict with Russia, requiring investments in defence capabilities and in alliance coordination that had been neglected during the post-Cold War period when major interstate conflict in Europe seemed unlikely. For Britain specifically, the crisis exposed vulnerabilities in its political system when democratic governance was disrupted, showing that the informal constitutional arrangements and the interim leadership structures that had been created following Starmer's disgrace were insufficient for managing major international crises. This realisation accelerated calls for constitutional reform and for ensuring clearer authority and democratic legitimacy in government, even during political transitions. King Charles's active role in the crisis was generally judged as having been helpful given the circumstances, but also raised questions about whether the monarchy should have such capacity for independent action and whether future crises might not be handled as well if circumstances were different. The ultimate lesson was that international security remained fragile and dependent on deterrence and resolve that had to be constantly maintained, and that domestic political stability and constitutional clarity were important not just for routine governance, but for ensuring effective response to external threats.